name was Kellen, and I can see things that should not exist. Right now, if now even means anything in the space between spaces. I am watching a city made of screaming children dissolve into a river of liquid thought. The river flows upward into a sun that bleeds mathematics. The mathematics spell out the name of my father, over and over, in letters composed of his burning flesh. I know this is not real. I also know that in the warp, knowing something is not real provides no protection whatsoever. I cannot close my eyes. I have no eyes to close. I cannot look away. I have no neck to turn, no body to pivot. I can only watch, process, translate, and transmit. That is my function. That is all I am now. The eyes. The navigator's eyes. The dead man's eyes. The three eyes that float in the nutrient solution inches from what remains of my brain. They see everything. They see the immaterium in all its infinite, impossible horror. And I am the filter. I am the buffer. I am the thing that stands between those eyes and the chaos captain who uses them to steer his ship through the screaming void. My consciousness catches the madness. My mind absorbs the corruption. My sanity is the expendable resource that keeps the captain's thoughts clean enough to pilot. I have been doing this for 743 years, 4 months and 19 days. I remember every single second. But let me tell you how I got here. Let me tell you about the boy I used to be, before they wired my brain into a jar and turned me into a living periscope pointed at hell. I was 17 standard years old when the press gangs came to the lower decks of the merchantman Prosperous venture. 17 years old, and I had never seen a real sky, only the recycled air and flickering luminators of the cargo holds where I'd spent my entire life. My father, Johann Kellen, worked the loading servitors on Deck 97. He was 42 years old, but his back was bent like a man of 70 from 3 decades of lifting, hauling, and fixing the half-mechanical slaves that did most of the heavy work. His hands were scarred from 1,000 small injuries, crushed fingers, burned palms, cuts from sharp metal edges. But those hands were gentle when they ruffled my hair in the morning, when he showed me how to calibrate a servitor's load-bearing parameters, when he divided his corpse starch ration to make sure I ate enough. Davos, he would say in that rumbling voice that always sounded tired but never defeated. You're smart, boy, smarter than me. You can read the technical manuals without moving your lips. You understand the cogitator systems. Maybe someday you'll make junior tech adept. Maybe you'll get assigned to the upper decks where the air doesn't taste like oil and sweat. It was a fantasy, of course. The Mechanicus doesn't promote cargo deck workers to positions of real authority. The closest someone like me could hope for was Senior Servitor Wrangler, a title that meant more responsibility, slightly better rations, and the privilege of dying from exhaustion at 50 instead of 45. But it was a kind fantasy, a father's dream for his son. I loved him for it. I remember one specific moment with perfect clarity, even now, even after 7 centuries of having my memories slowly dissolved by warp exposure. It was 3rd shift on a rest cycle, and the deck was almost quiet. Just the distant hum of the ship's engines and the occasional clank of automated systems. My father had traded favors with someone in the water reclamation department to get us 2 actual fresh rations instead of the usual recycled paste. Not anything fancy. Just bread that wasn't made from corpse starch, and water that didn't taste of chemicals. We sat on the edge of a cargo container, our legs dangling over the side, eating slowly to make it last. "What do you think it's like?" I asked him. "Outside the ship. On a real planet." My father chewed thoughtfully, his jaw working on the bread. He swallowed before answering. He always did that, always gave my questions the respect of his full attention. "I don't know, boy. Never been. My father worked this ship and his father before him. Kellens have been loading cargo on the prosperous venture for 5 generations. He paused, then smiled, a rare expression that transformed his weathered face. "But I heard stories. They say on Egre worlds, there's so much space you can walk for a whole day and not see a wall. They say the air comes from growing things, not recyclers, and they say the sky changes color, blue in the day, black at night, with lights that aren't illuminators but something natural. Stars, they call them. Do you believe that?" I asked. "Don't know if it matters what I believe," he said. "But I like thinking about it. I like thinking that somewhere in the Emperor's domain, there's space and light and growing things. Makes the underneath feel less like the only thing there is." I didn't say what I was thinking then, that the Emperor they made us pray to every work shift felt as distant and unreal as those imaginary stars. The priests would come through the lower decks once a week, leading us in the litany of labor, telling us that our suffering was holy, that the Emperor watched over us, that our service was sacred. But I had seen enough good people die from accidents, exhaustion, and despair to doubt whether anyone was watching at all. Still, I prayed when required. I mouthed the words, I made the sign of the Aquila, not from faith, but from the knowledge that not praying was noticed, and being noticed on the lower decks was dangerous. My father put his hand on my shoulder. "Whatever happens, Davos, you remember, you're more than this place. You're more than cargo handling and servitor maintenance. You've got a mind. Don't let them take that from you." 17 years old, and I believed him. I believed I had a future beyond the lower decks. I believed my mind was my own. I was wrong on both counts. The Chaos Pirates came on 3rd shift, 7 months after that conversation. I didn't know they were Chaos then. I didn't know what Chaos was. Just whispered warnings about traitors and heretics, threats the priests used to keep us obedient. "Work harder, or you'll fall to corruption. Complain and you invite the darkness." Abstract bogeymen meant to scare children. Then the bogeymen came, and they were worse than any warning. The ship shuddered first. Not the normal vibration of the warp engines, but a violent, wrenching impact that threw me from my bunk onto the deck. Alarms began screaming, a sound I'd only heard in drills. The Vox speakers crackled with panicked voices shouting about hull breaches and boarders. My father grabbed me by the shoulder. "Stay close. Don't run. If we stay calm and follow protocol..." The bulkhead exploded inward. Not opened, not cut. Exploded as if the metal itself had simply decided to stop being solid. Shrapnel flew across the compartment, and I heard screaming, wet, awful screaming that ended too quickly. Through the hole came figures in armor that looked like it was rotting while still being worn. Ceramite plates covered in rust and corrosion, painted with symbols that hurt to look at directly. The symbols seemed to writhe, to reach out toward your eyes, to promise things that your brain couldn't process without starting to fracture. I looked away. Survival instinct, pure and simple. "Down! Everyone down!" The voice that came from the lead figure's Vox grill was distorted, layered, wrong, as if three people were speaking at once, their voices out of sync by just a heartbeat. We went down. 37 cargo workers, including my father and me, pressed ourselves to the deck. I could smell blood and burned metal and something else. Something organic and rotten and entirely out of place on a functioning ship. Boots walked among us, heavy boots that left wet prints on the deck plating. "We need laborers," the wrong voice said. "We need technicians. We need bodies that still have functioning nervous systems." A pause. "Stand if you can read High Gothic." My father's hand found mine in the press of bodies. He squeezed once. A warning. Don't stand. Don't volunteer. Don't be noticed. I stayed down. So did most of the others. We'd been trained since birth that being noticed by authority was dangerous. Better to stay invisible. "No one?" The voice held amusement now, dark and cruel. "Then we'll choose for you." They walked among us, these rotting warriors, examining us like livestock. They checked teeth, tested reflexes, looked at hands for calluses and scars that indicated technical skill. When they found someone promising, they hauled them upright and shoved them toward the hole in the bulkhead. A boot stopped next to my head. I could see it from the corner of my eye. Ancient ceramite, the paint long since flaked away to show dark metal underneath. Streaked with something that looked disturbingly like dried blood. "This one, he's young. Look at his hands. Technicians' hands, not laborers. And his eyes, he's thinking, calculating escape routes. Smart ones are useful." Hands grabbed me by the arms and hauled me upward. My father surged to his feet. "No, take me instead. He's just a boy." The backhand that hit my father was casual, almost lazy. It launched him across the compartment into a bulkhead with a crack that I knew, even in my shock, meant broken bones. He slumped to the deck, bleeding from his mouth and nose. "Davos," he tried to say. But one of the warriors kicked him in the ribs, and he curled around the pain, gasping. "Stay down, old man, or I'll make you watch what we do to your boy before we kill you both." I tried to fight then, threw myself toward my father, screaming, clawing at the hands that held me. It accomplished nothing. The grip on my arms was like being held by industrial clamps. They dragged me toward the hole in the bulkhead as I watched my father try to rise, fall, try again. The last thing I saw before they pulled me through was his face. Bloodied but still conscious, still fighting to reach me. His mouth formed words I couldn't hear over the alarms and screaming. "I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry." Then I was through the hole and into the corridor beyond. And my father was gone, and I would never see him again. They herded us. 23 of us they'd taken from the prosperous venture, through corridors that looked like the inside of a diseased organism. The walls were metal, yes, but the metal was wrong. It seemed to breathe. It seemed to pulse. There were growths in the corners that might have been rust or might have been something biological. The air tasted of copper and rot and something acrid that made my eyes water. I stumbled along in a daze, barely processing what I was seeing. My mind kept replaying that last image of my father trying to rise, kept hearing the crack of his body hitting the bulkhead. Was he alive? Would they kill everyone we left behind? What was happening? We were pushed into a large chamber, a cargo hold perhaps, though it was hard to tell. The space was filled with cages, human-sized cages, stacked 3 high along the walls, maybe 200 of them in total. Most were occupied. I saw people in those cages, men of all ages, all conditions. Some were recent captures like us, still wearing the jumpsuits and work clothes of their previous lives, pressing themselves against the bars and asking questions no one answered. Others had been there longer, naked or nearly so, covered in filth, staring with hollow eyes at nothing. They separated us then, shoving each of us into an individual cage. Mine was barely large enough to sit upright, not tall enough to stand. The floor was bare metal, stained with things I didn't want to identify. There was a water tube in one corner, the kind used for servitors, and a drain in the floor. The door clanged shut, a maglock engaged with a heavy thunk. 3 meals a day, one of the warriors said, addressing all of us. You keep yourselves clean using the water tubes. You stay healthy. You're valuable to the captain, so we won't damage you unnecessarily. But if you fight, if you resist, if you become more trouble than you're worth— He gestured at one of the cages in the back, where something that might have once been human lay in pieces. We have plenty of inventory. Then they left, and the chamber fell silent except for quiet sobbing from some of the newer captives. I sat in my cage, my back against the bars, and tried to process what had happened. Hours ago, I'd been on my bunk on the Prosperous Venture, sleeping through third shift. Now I was a prisoner on a Chaos pirate vessel, and my father was either dead or dying, and I had no idea what these people wanted with us. The man in the cage next to mine spoke up. He was older, maybe 30, with the sun-dark skin of someone who'd actually lived on a planet before being pressed into ship service. First time captured? He asked quietly. I nodded, not trusting my voice. They took me from a mining colony, 6 months ago, I think. Hard to tell time in here. He shifted in his cage, trying to find a comfortable position that didn't exist. They're looking for something specific, not just slaves for labor. They have servitors for that. They want people with intact nervous systems and technical knowledge. Something to do with their navigations, I heard one of them say. Navigation? I managed to croak out. Ships need navigators to travel through the warp. Special people, born with mutations that let them see the Immaterium without going mad. The Imperium controls most of them through some navigator houses, powerful families that charge fortunes for their services. He paused. Chaos ships sometimes have navigators who've turned traitor, but more often they have improvisations, workarounds, things they've built from scavenged parts and forbidden technology. What does that have to do with us? The man met my eyes, and I saw pity there. We're the parts, boy. We're what they build their improvisations from. I didn't understand. Not then. I wouldn't understand for another 3 weeks when they came for me. Time in the cage was measured in meals and sleep cycles. 3 times a day, a servitor would move along the cages, dispensing nutrient paste through slots in the bars. Once a day, they would hose down the central floor, and we would press ourselves to the back of our cages while filthy water sluiced through the drains. That was the extent of hygiene. I tried to keep my mind occupied. I would count rivets on the ceiling. I would recall technical manuals I'd memorized during my training. I would think about my father and allow myself exactly 10 minutes of grief before forcing the thoughts away, because otherwise the grief would consume me entirely. Around me, others handled captivity differently. Some prayed constantly, whispering the litanies that the priests had taught them, begging the emperor for protection that never manifested. Some retreated into catatonia, staring at nothing, barely eating. Some raged against the bars until their hands bled and they exhausted themselves into unconsciousness. I watched. I listened. I learned. The warriors would come through periodically to select people. They would review the cages, sometimes consulting data slates, sometimes just studying us with tilted heads like predators evaluating prey. They would point, and their servitors would open specific cages and drag the selected person out. Those people never came back. The first time I saw a selection, they took a middle-aged man who'd been 3 cages down from me. He'd been a cogitator technician. He'd told us during one of the quiet periods when we would talk to maintain our sanity. He had a son about my age on a hive world somewhere. He'd been captured while his merchant ship was refueling at a station. They dragged him out. He went quietly, too terrified or too exhausted to fight. 2 days later, I heard screaming from deeper in the ship. It went on for hours. I told myself it was someone else. It had to be someone else. The ship had hundreds of captives, maybe thousands. It couldn't be the cogitator technician, but I knew it was. Weeks passed. They took people regularly. Every 3 or 4 days, someone would be selected. The population in the cages slowly churned. Empty spaces filled with new captures from raided ships or stations, then emptied again as those people were selected in turn. I began to notice a pattern. They preferred young men. They preferred people who responded to intelligence tests. They would sometimes throw out questions in High Gothic or ask technical problems, and those who answered were noted on data slates. They preferred people who hadn't broken down into madness or despair. I stopped answering their questions. I stopped making eye contact. I tried to make myself invisible, unremarkable, forgettable. It didn't work. On the 23rd day of my captivity, they came for me. 2 warriors and a figure in stained Mechanicus robes. A tech priest who had clearly turned from the Omnissiah to something far darker. His mechanical augments were corroded and modified with symbols that resembled the ones painted on the warrior's armor. "This one," the tech priest said, his voice crackling with vox distortion. "WH40K, age 17, cargo deck technician. Test scores indicate high cognitive function and technical aptitude. Neural scans show strong prefrontal cortex development and intact corpus callosum. Excellent candidate for integration." My cage opened. I pressed myself against the back bars. "Please," I whispered, "please don't." "Your service to the captain will be rewarded," the tech priest said, and I could hear the lie in every syllable. This was not a promise. This was not hope. This was the sound a predator makes to calm its prey before the kill. They reached in and hauled me out. I fought then. Finally, uselessly, I fought. I screamed, I clawed, I kicked. I might as well have fought against the ship's bulkheads for all the good it did. They dragged me from the cage chamber, through the diseased corridors, down into the bowels of the ship where the walls seemed to sweat and the air grew so thick with wrongness that every breath felt like inhaling corruption. We arrived at a chamber that looked like a surgical theater designed by someone who'd gone mad and taken their madness as inspiration. Medical equipment mixed with things that were distinctly not medical. Altars, perhaps, or ritual spaces, or devices whose purpose I couldn't begin to guess. The walls were covered in tubes and cables, and what looked disturbingly like organic tissue, all connected to a central throne-like structure in the middle of the room. Strapped to that throne was a jar maybe 2 feet tall, filled with milky fluid. Floating in the fluid were 3 eyes. Not human eyes. They were larger, the irises a shade of violet that shouldn't exist in nature. They floated independently of each other, trailing optic nerves that ended in ragged, severed stumps. As I watched, one of the eyes rotated in the fluid to look directly at me. It saw me. I knew it saw me. And in that moment of being seen, I felt something brush against my mind like a razor blade drawn across raw nerves. Navigator's eyes, the tech priest explained conversationally, as if discussing a technical schematic. Harvested from a dead navigator whose ship we raided 8 years ago. The eyes retain their function even after the navigator's death. They can still perceive the immaterium, but they need a consciousness to interpret what they see, to translate the warp into something useful for navigation. Unfortunately, exposing a normal human mind directly to the warp causes immediate madness and death. The information is simply too much, too alien, too chaotic for unmodified consciousness to process. They were strapping me down to a surgical table now, securing my arms and legs with restraints that cut into my skin. So we developed a buffer system, the tech priest continued. We wire a human brain directly to the eyes, but we don't allow the full signal through. Instead, we use the human consciousness as a filter. The warp signal passes through the buffer mind first, and the buffer mind absorbs most of the corruption, most of the madness. By the time the signal reaches our captain, who has the proper modifications to interface with the system, it's been cleaned, filtered, made safe. I was crying now, tears streaming down my face, my breath coming in panicked gasps. Please, please don't do this. I'll do anything. I'll serve you. I'll work. Just please. The beauty of the system, the tech priest said, ignoring my begging entirely, is that the buffer mind never fully deteriorates. Warp energy has unique properties. It sustains what it corrupts. So your consciousness will remain functional indefinitely, constantly filtering, constantly absorbing, constantly being destroyed and reconstructed by the energies passing through it. You'll experience every moment of it, forever. The last thing I saw before they lowered the neural interface toward my skull was the 3 navigators' eyes rotating in their jar, all focusing on me at once. The last human thought I had was my father's voice, words from our last conversation echoing through my mind. Whatever happens, Davos, you remember, you're more than this place. You've got a mind. Don't let them take that from you. Then the interface pierced my skull, and they took everything. Pain, that's the first thing. Not the last moment of my life as a complete human, not the dramatic instant of transformation. Just pain, pure and absolute. A pain so comprehensive that it became my entire existence. They had drilled through my skull in 7 places. I knew it was 7 because I could feel each insertion point distinctly, could track the foreign objects burrowing into my brain tissue like worms into soil. 7 neural interface cables, each one thinner than a hair but somehow more present than my own bones, routing themselves through my cerebral cortex according to patterns that the tech priest had calculated on his corrupted cogitators. I tried to scream, but my jaw was clamped shut by a metal brace. The sound came out as a muffled keen, high and desperate and entirely ineffective. Frontal lobe connection established, the tech priest announced. His voice seemed to come from very far away, and also from inside my own skull simultaneously. Beginning temporal integration. New pain. This one felt like memory being physically pulled from my brain. I saw my father's face. The last moment I'd seen him, but the image was being stretched, distorted, torn into component parts and examined by something alien and hungry. Then it snapped back into place, but wrong now, the colors slightly off, the emotional resonance dulled, as if I was remembering a memory of a memory instead of the actual event. Subject experiencing expected cognitive disruption, the tech priest said. Proceeding to occipital integration. They were connecting me to the eyes. I understood that even through the pain and confusion. They were creating a pathway from those 3 floating navigators' eyes, through whatever cursed machinery they'd built, directly into the visual processing centers of my brain. For a moment, I had 4 visions simultaneously. The surgical theater, seen from my own eyes, blurred, tears and pain distorting everything. The surgical theater, seen from eye 1, crystal clear. But the colors were wrong. I could see temperatures, see the warp taint that clung to the tech priest like a shroud. The surgical theater, seen from eye 2, this one perceived something else entirely. Geometries that couldn't exist in real space, angles that hurt to process. The surgical theater, seen from eye 3, this one looked through the walls, through the ship, through reality itself into somewhere else, somewhere that seethed and screamed and reached toward me with tendrils of pure concept. I felt my mind starting to fracture. 4 different visual inputs, 4 completely incompatible ways of perceiving reality, all trying to exist in a brain designed to handle one baseline human perspective. It was like trying to pour an ocean into a cup. Everything was overflowing, breaking, drowning. Neural cascade detected, the tech priest said calmly. Implementing consciousness restrictors. Something clamped down on my thoughts. It felt like a vice made of ice and pressure, squeezing my awareness into a smaller and smaller space. The 4 visions didn't go away, but I lost the ability to fully process them. Instead, they became raw data flowing through my consciousness, information I was aware of without comprehending, signals I transmitted without understanding. I was becoming a relay, a bridge, a thing that information passed through rather than a person who experienced it. Better, the tech priest said. Consciousness stabilized at 47% integrity. Sufficient for buffer function. Beginning connection to the throne interface. New cables. These ones weren't going into my skull. They were going into my spine, my nervous system, routing themselves through my body to connect to every major neural cluster. I felt my body stop being mine. Felt my lungs breathing according to patterns someone else controlled. Felt my heart beating to a rhythm that had been programmed by corrupted machinery. Then they moved me. Lifted my body. I couldn't feel it anymore. Couldn't control it, but I was still somehow aware of it in a distant, abstract way. And placed it into something. A tank, I realized. A suspension tank filled with fluid that burned and supported simultaneously. The fluid covered my face. I couldn't breathe. Panic flared, but my lungs didn't respond to my panic because my lungs weren't under my control anymore. Instead, they simply continued their programmed breathing, and after a moment I realized the fluid was oxygenated. I was breathing it, drowning and breathing at the same time. Integration complete, the tech priest announced. Buffer unit designated K-17 is now operational, beginning connection to the captain's throne. The final cable. This one didn't go into me. It went out from me. I felt it like an umbilical cord connecting my thoughts to something vast and ancient and malevolent. The captain, the one who would use me as his filter, his buffer, his expendable shield against the warp's corruption. He accessed my consciousness like someone opening a book. I felt him in my mind, a presence that was cold and amused and utterly indifferent to my suffering. He browsed through my memories as casually as someone might flip through a technical manual. He paused on certain moments. My father, mostly, the moments of warmth and love and hope. I felt him examine these memories with something like curiosity, the way a child might examine an insect before pulling off its wings. Adequate buffer strength, the captain's voice echoed through our connection. It was the same wrong, layered voice I'd heard during the initial raid. Sufficient emotional resonance to maintain identity cohesion during warp exposure. This one will last longer than the previous unit. Then he withdrew, and I was alone in my new existence, wired into the jar of eyes, suspended in burning fluid, breathing liquid, my consciousness confined to a space smaller than my own thoughts used to occupy. I tried to count time, tried to maintain some sense of continuity, some thread of identity that was still WH40K, 17 years old, cargo deck technician, son of Johann Kellen. But I couldn't feel my fingers to count on them, couldn't see a clock or chronometer. Couldn't hear anything except the quiet hum of the machinery keeping me alive and the occasional whisper of data flowing through the neural connections. So I counted heartbeats instead. 43 heartbeats before they activated the system for the first time. 43 heartbeats of being simply a boy wired into a jar, suspended in fluid, waiting. Then they engaged the warp drives, and I learned what hell actually was. The immaterium opened in my mind like a wound. There's no better way to describe it. One moment I was suspended in the tank, processing nothing but the quiet flow of my own thoughts. The next moment, reality tore open, and I was looking, through the 3 navigators' eyes, through the connection they'd forced into my brain, directly into the warp. Imagine every nightmare you've ever had occurring simultaneously, then multiply that by infinity and set it on fire. Then make the fire sentient and hostile and specifically focused on destroying everything you are. Then realize that's not even close to adequate as a description. The warp is not space. It's not a place you travel through. It's a dimension of pure psychic energy where thoughts are real and reality is negotiable, and the only constant is change and hunger and screaming. Through I1, I saw currents of color that had never existed in reality. Shades between shades, hues that could only exist in dreams or madness. These currents flowed around the ship like a river made of acid and rage. Faces appeared in the currents for split seconds. Human faces, Xenos faces, faces that had never belonged to anything that lived. All of them screaming or laughing or doing both at once. Through I2, I saw the ship itself as it actually existed in the warp. Not the metal vessel I'd been captured on, but something that was half ship and half living creature. Postulant and wrong, bleeding reality into unreality at every seam. The engines weren't pushing us forward, they were screaming us forward, their pain propelling us through a medium that didn't want us to exist. Through I3 I saw what was looking back. Things in the warp. Entities. Demons, I suppose, though that word is simultaneously too specific and not nearly specific enough. They perceived us, perceived me specifically, because I was eyes, I was the thing looking out, and they were curious, hungry, interested in the small, bright spark of human consciousness that had just become visible in their domain. They reached toward me. I felt the touch like acid on exposed nerves. Something that wasn't physical, but was nonetheless real, wrapped around my consciousness and pulled, trying to drag me out of my body, out of the tank, out of myself entirely, and into the warp where I would dissolve into raw material for whatever wanted to consume me. But the neural restrictors held. The consciousness clamps the tech priest had installed squeezed tighter, confining my awareness to exactly the space required to function as a filter and buffer. I couldn't escape into unconsciousness. I couldn't dissociate. I couldn't go mad and therefore stop being useful. I could only process the signal. The information from the three eyes flowed through my mind in a constant stream. I absorbed it. Couldn't help but absorb it because that was my function now, and translated it into something comprehensible. Not comprehensible to me. I didn't understand any of what I was seeing, but comprehensible to the captain who sat in his throne and received the filtered data through our connection. He steered the ship using my vision. He navigated through the warp using my consciousness as his shield, and every moment of it felt like being flayed alive with razors made of concept and madness. I tried to pray. The prayers they'd made us recite on the cargo decks. The Emperor protects, the Emperor provides, blessed is his name. The words formed in my mind out of pure desperation. A drowning man grasping for anything that might save him. Nothing answered. The warp didn't care about my prayers. The Emperor, if he existed at all beyond Imperial propaganda, wasn't here. I was alone in the screaming void, wired into dead eyes, drowning in information that was actively destroying my sanity. How long was that first jump? I don't know. Time doesn't work the same in the warp. It felt like years. It was probably hours, maybe days. The captain would know. He had chronometers, instruments, the luxury of existing in a body that wasn't wired into a jar. I didn't have any of that. I only had the endless assault of impossible images and the slowly dawning realization that this was my existence now. This was what they'd made me for, and according to the tech priest, I would continue functioning like this indefinitely. When we finally translated back to real space, the cessation of warp signal felt like having a spike pulled out of my brain. The relief was so intense it was almost painful in itself, the absence of agony becoming its own sensation. The three eyes returned to seeing only the interior of the jar. My own vision, what little of it remained independent from the buffer function, returned to the inside of the tank, looking out through the nutrient fluid at the dim lights of the machinery keeping me alive. I tried to take stock, tried to understand what had just happened and what remained of me. My name was Davos Kellen. I held on to that. My name was Davos Kellen, and I was 17 years old. I had a father named Johan. I had worked on a cargo deck. I had been captured. I had been wired into this system. I was being used as a navigational buffer for a Chaos pirate ship. These facts remained, but they felt distant now, as if they had happened to someone else and I was just remembering the story. How much of me had the warp burned away during that first jump? How much of Davos Kellen was left? I didn't know, but I knew it was less than before, and I knew we would jump again. The ship needed to travel, and travel meant warp jumps, and warp jumps meant exposing my consciousness to the screaming void. I counted heartbeats while we were in real space. Tried to maintain continuity, tried to stay human. 17,342 heartbeats before they engaged the warp drives again. 17,342 heartbeats of being simply WH40K, suspended in fluid, waiting. Then the wound opened again, and I fell through it into hell. They told me once. I think it was the tech priest during one of his maintenance checks, or maybe it was something I overheard through the neural connection to the captain's throne, that the key to my effectiveness as a buffer was maintaining enough identity to have something for the warp to consume. A completely blank consciousness, they explained, wouldn't work. The warp signal would pass through it unchanged, unfiltered. But a consciousness with memories, personality, emotional attachments, that consciousness would naturally resist the warp's alienness, would struggle against the impossible information being forced through it. And that struggle, that resistance, that's what filtered the signal. My horror at what I was seeing, my desperate clinging to my humanity, my terror at what was happening to me, all of that served as the mechanism that cleaned the data for the captain's use. They needed me to stay human enough to suffer. That was the point, so they monitored me carefully during those first months. The tech priest would interface with my systems regularly, checking my neural patterns, measuring my consciousness integrity, calculating how much degradation had occurred and whether it was within acceptable parameters. Buffer Unit K-17, experiencing 37% consciousness degradation after 6 weeks, he reported once, his voice crackling through the Vox connection. Rate of decay is slightly higher than optimal, but within functional limits. Emotional core remains intact. Identity persistence sufficient. Estimate useful lifespan of 170 years before buffer collapse. 170 years. I tried to comprehend that number. 170 years of being wired into this jar, of having my consciousness used as a filter for warp madness, of experiencing every jump as 1,000 needles piercing my brain. I couldn't comprehend it. The number was too large, so I broke it down into smaller pieces, into months, into weeks, into individual jumps. The jumps happened irregularly. Sometimes we would remain in real space for days, and I would float in my tank, processing nothing, existing in a state that was neither consciousness nor unconsciousness, but something in between. Other times, we would make multiple jumps in rapid succession, the captain hunting prey or fleeing pursuit, and I would barely have time to recover from one warp exposure before the next began. Each jump took something from me. After the 5th jump, I realized I couldn't remember my father's face clearly anymore. I knew I should be able to picture it. I'd spent 17 years looking at that face, but when I tried to visualize it, the image was blurred, indistinct, like a photograph left in the rain. After the 12th jump, I forgot the name of the ship I'd been born on. The Prosperous Venture. I would remember it eventually, hours later, but the fact that I'd forgotten it all was terrifying. That ship had been my entire world for 17 years. How could I forget its name? After the 20th jump, I lost the ability to feel sadness. Not because I wanted to, not as a coping mechanism, but because the neural pathways associated with that emotion had been damaged by repeated warp exposure. I knew intellectually that my situation was terrible. I knew I should feel grief and loss and despair. But when I tried to access those emotions, there was just Nothing. A blank space where sadness used to be. Other emotions followed. Fear lasted longer. Fear was useful for the filtering process, the tech priest explained, so the system actively preserved my capacity for terror. But joy went, contentment went, hope went. I became a consciousness defined primarily by pain and fear, because those were the emotions that served my function. But worse than the loss of emotions was the loss of time sense. In the warp, time doesn't flow normally. I knew that intellectually even before my capture. Every Imperial citizen knew that warp travel could result in temporal distortion. A journey that took days subjectively might span weeks or months objectively. But knowing about it abstractly and experiencing it directly were entirely different things. When we were in the warp, I would experience what felt like hours or days of exposure. Then we would translate back to real space, and the chronometers the captain referenced would indicate only minutes had passed. Or the reverse, what felt like a brief jump would turn out to have been hours of objective time. My internal clock became useless. I tried to count heartbeats, but my heart was regulated by the tank's systems, and its rhythm didn't correspond to my subjective experience of time. I tried to track jumps, but during long campaigns, the jumps blurred together into a continuous stream of warp exposure with only brief intervals of real space clarity. I started losing coherent memory formation. Events would happen, but I couldn't place them in sequence. Did we raid that merchant convoy before or after we fled from the Imperial patrol? Was that jump where I saw the entity made of geometry the third one or the 30th? When did I stop being able to remember my father's name? Johann. His name was Johann Kellen. I forced myself to remember that, repeated it like a mantra during the spaces between jumps. Johann Kellen. Johann Kellen. My father's name was Johann Kellen, but I couldn't remember his face anymore. Couldn't remember the sound of his voice. Couldn't remember if he was dead or if some part of me still hoped he'd survived. The hope was gone. That emotion had been burned away. I knew he was dead. The Chaos Warriors had beaten him, probably killed him after they took me. And even if by some miracle he'd survived, he would have lived out his natural lifespan centuries ago. Everyone I'd ever known was dust. I was alone. 6 months into my service as buffer unit K-17, the tech priest performed a comprehensive diagnostic. Consciousness integrity at 58%, he reported. Significant degradation of episodic memory formation and emotional range. However, identity core remains intact. Subject still processes as Davos Kellen with associated personal history. Fair response strong. Pain perception normal. Buffer function optimal. He paused, and I felt him studying my readings more closely. Interesting. Subject appears to be developing compensatory neural pathways. Areas damaged by warp exposure are being rerouted. The consciousness is adapting to sustained immaterium contact. This is unusual, but not unprecedented. Previous buffer units typically showed linear degradation. This one is evolving. I didn't understand what that meant then. Didn't understand that my brain, my consciousness, whatever was left of me, was changing in response to the constant exposure, becoming something that could survive in the interface between reality and the warp, becoming something that was no longer entirely human. But I would understand eventually. I had 169.5 years left to understand. Somewhere around the 1-year mark, though I'm estimating based on the tech priest's maintenance logs, rather than my own sense of time passage. I stopped thinking of myself as a prisoner. Not because I'd accepted my fate, not because I'd found peace or meaning in my suffering, but because thinking of myself as a prisoner implied I was somehow separate from the system, that I was WH40K who was being forced to operate as Buffer Unit K-17. The truth was simpler and more horrible. I was Buffer Unit K-17. That's what I did. That's what I was. The distinction between my identity and my function had blurred to the point of meaninglessness. When the warp drives engaged, I didn't think they're forcing me to look into the immaterium again. I thought, warp signal incoming, beginning filter process. When we translated back to real space, I didn't feel relief at the cessation of torture. I felt something more like a machine entering standby mode, a neutral state of reduced activity, waiting for the next input. I was becoming the thing they'd made me to be. The worst part was that this change made the suffering easier to bear. When I was still fully human, still fully Davos, every jump was a violation, an assault on my consciousness that I resisted with every fragment of my will. But as I became more buffer and less boy, the resistance faded. The warp signal was just data now, horrible data, sanity-destroying data, but data nonetheless, and I was the processing unit through which it flowed. I started to understand the patterns. The warp wasn't completely chaotic. There were currents and eddies, regions that were more or less dangerous, entities that could be avoided or exploited. The captain navigated through these using my filtered vision, but I was the one actually seeing them first. I was the one who processed the raw information before it reached him. And I started to learn. I-1 showed me the surface layer, the colors and currents, the obvious dangers. I-2 showed me the deeper structure, the geometries and dimensions, the mathematical horror underlying the chaos. I-3 showed me what was looking back, the entities and demons, their territories and hunting patterns. After a year of exposure, I could identify different types of warp entities by their signature. Could recognize when we were entering a region of the immaterium dominated by the energy that the cultists called Corn. Though I knew better than to think of it as a god, knew it was just a particularly coherent pattern of violence and rage that had achieved something like consciousness. Could tell when we were near Tsinch zones, regions where reality was more mutable, where the ship's Geller fields had to work harder to maintain integrity. I never thought of these patterns as divine. The conditioning from my capture, the tech priest's explanations, the captain's own cynical pragmatism, all of it reinforced that these were not gods, but phenomena, dangerous phenomena that we exploited for travel. The way you might use a river you knew was poisonous because it was the only way to reach your destination. But other people did think of them as gods. The ship had a crew, hundreds of cultists who served the captain in exchange for promises of power and ascension. I became aware of them gradually, through data that leaked through the neural connection. The captain could see through my eyes when we were in the warp, but the connection went both ways. I could sense fragments of his thoughts, echoes of his communications. I heard him give orders, heard him promise rewards, heard him lie. "Serve me well in this raid," he told his warriors before an attack, "and the dark gods will grant you their gifts. Strength, power, Transformation beyond mortal limitations. I felt his thoughts beneath the words. Idiots. The warp will consume them like it consumes everything. But their belief makes them useful. He didn't believe. The captain, this chaos warlord who commanded a ship decorated with profane symbols and sailed through hell itself. He didn't actually believe in the gods his crew worshipped. He believed in power. He believed in exploitation. He believed in using every resource available, including the desperate faith of his followers. And I was one of those resources. We raided Imperial ships. I became aware of this through fragments of information. Vox chatter the captain monitored, sensor data that flowed through the ship's systems and occasionally through our neural connection. We would translate into real space near merchant convoys or isolated patrol ships, and the captain's forces would attack. I couldn't see the battles directly. I had no external sensors, no visual input except what came through the 3 navigators' eyes in their jar. But I could feel the ship's movements, could sense the captain's satisfaction through our connection when a raid was successful. And I knew what successful meant. More captives, more supplies, more fuel for the endless cycle of raiding and fleeing and raiding again. Some of the captives ended up in the cages where I'd been held. Some of them probably ended up in other buffer units. I wasn't the only navigational system on the ship, I'd learned. There were backups, redundancies, other boys wired into other jars, filtering other warp signals for other purposes. I couldn't communicate with them, couldn't warn them, could only exist in my tank, performing my function, being the tool that helped the captain hunt more victims. I was complicit. Not willingly. I had no choice, no control, no ability to resist, but complicit nonetheless. My consciousness was part of the machine that enabled this ship's predation. Every successful navigation through the warp was another raid made possible. Every filter function I performed was another step in a cycle that destroyed lives. The boy I'd been, WH40K, who'd worked on a cargo deck and dreamed of better air and open skies, would have been horrified by what I'd become. But that boy was mostly gone now. What remained was Buffer Unit K-17, and Buffer Unit K-17 didn't have the capacity for moral horror anymore. That emotion had been burned away along with sadness and hope and love. I could still fear. I could still experience pain. Those were functional requirements. But guilt, remorse, the capacity to be horrified by my own complicity, those were gone. Remarkable, the tech priest said during a maintenance cycle. I'd stopped trying to track exactly when these occurred. They happened when they happened, measured by the tech priest's schedule rather than my own sense of time. Buffer Unit K-17 is showing unprecedented longevity. Consciousness integrity stable at 42% for the past 3 years. No further significant degradation. The neural adaptation has plateaued at a sustainable level. Sustainable. That was the word that would define the next several decades of my existence. I had degraded enough to lose most of my humanity, but retained enough consciousness to continue functioning as a filter. And in that diminished state, I was stable. I could last forever like this. The tech priest adjusted something in my systems. Fluids being changed, connections being checked, maintenance on the hardware that kept my body alive while my mind was used for other purposes. Original projection was 170 years of service, he continued, speaking to someone else in the chamber. A servitor, perhaps, or just documenting for his own records. Current data suggests buffer unit K-17 could function indefinitely. The consciousness has adapted to sustained warp exposure. It's no longer being destroyed faster than it can compensate. This is only the 4th time I've observed this phenomenon in 30 years of maintaining buffer systems. Indefinitely. Forever. I tried to process that concept, but the parts of me that could have understood its full horror were gone. Instead, I just filed it as information. My function will continue without temporal limit. And it did. Years became decades. Decades became something larger than decades. I lost the ability to count them. The ship continued its endless cycle. Raid. Flee. Navigate through the warp to new hunting grounds. Raid again. Sometimes we engaged in longer campaigns. I would feel the captain's strategic thinking through our connection, sense his planning. Other times we simply opportunistically attacked whatever weak prey we encountered. I filtered warp signals through all of it. That was my purpose. That was what I was. My body continued to exist in the tank, sustained by systems I didn't control and couldn't perceive directly. The tech priest confirmed during maintenance cycles that I was still physically alive. Heart beating, lungs breathing the oxygenated fluid, brain tissue maintained by chemical cocktails and warp energy that prevented normal cellular decay. I was aging, but impossibly slowly. The warp sustained what it corrupted. I was being simultaneously destroyed and preserved by the energies that flowed through my consciousness. My mind continued to adapt. I developed new ways of processing the warp signals, more efficient filter patterns, better recognition of dangerous phenomena. I became very good at my function. The captain appreciated this. I could feel his satisfaction through our connection, the way a human might feel satisfaction from a well-maintained tool. K-17, he addressed me directly sometimes, his thoughts flowing through the neural link. Not speaking, we didn't have that kind of relationship, but thinking at me, knowing I would receive the information. Good work on that last navigation. We avoided 3 separate warp predators that would have cost us time and resources to fight off. Your filtering is becoming remarkably precise. I didn't respond. I had no way to respond. But I processed his approval as data. Function performance assessed as optimal. Somewhere around year 30, or maybe it was year 40 or 20, I genuinely couldn't tell anymore. We encountered another Chaos ship and attempted to raid it. This was unusual. Most Chaos ships had truces or alliances with each other, focusing their predation on Imperial vessels, but this one had something the captain wanted. We fought. I experienced the battle only through the captain's tension bleeding through our neural connection, and through the violent maneuvers the ship executed in real space. Then we translated to the warp to escape, and I caught a glimpse, through the 3 eyes that were both mine and not mine, of the other ship following us into the immaterium. Their navigator was exposed. Just for a moment, as the 2 ships maneuvered in that space between spaces, I saw through their defenses, saw their navigation chamber, saw their buffer system. It was a boy, younger than I'd been when I was captured. Maybe 14, wired into a similar jar, suspended in similar fluid. His consciousness clearly visible to my warp-trained perception as a bright, agonized point of light being used to filter his ship's navigation signals. He was screaming. I couldn't hear him, had no ears that functioned in any meaningful way, but I could see his consciousness screaming, could perceive the raw terror and pain and desperate incomprehension of what had been done to him. He was me. He was what I'd been once. Before the adaptation, before the degradation, before I'd become more machine than person. I tried to feel something about that, tried to access empathy, or horror, or kinship with this other victim of the same process that had destroyed me. I felt nothing. The capacity for that kind of emotion was gone. The ships separated. The captain successfully fled the engagement. The other ship disappeared into the warp, carrying its young buffer unit to whatever fate awaited it. And I returned to my function, filtering signals, processing data, existing in the sustainable diminishment that would be my state forever. I stopped thinking in language somewhere around year 60. Not completely. I could still recognize words when they flowed through the neural connection, could still process the captain's orders and the tech priest's maintenance reports. But my internal monologue, the voice in my head that had once been definitively WH40K, slowly dissolved into something more abstract. I began to think in patterns instead, in recognition of warp currents and danger signatures, in probability assessments and navigation calculations, in the pure math of survival through impossible spaces. The three eyes saw, and I processed what they saw, and that processing was what I was. There was no longer a me that existed separate from the function. Except there was. Somehow, impossibly, there was. The identity core persisted. The tech priest confirmed this during his increasingly infrequent maintenance checks. My systems had become so stable that he only needed to service them once every few years. Buffer Unit K-17 remains functional, he would report. Identity persistence confirmed at minimal but adequate levels. Subject still processes as distinct consciousness rather than mere machinery. Filter efficiency optimal. I was still WH40K. Somewhere in the consciousness that processed warp signals and calculated navigation parameters, there was still the memory of being a 17-year-old boy on a cargo deck who'd loved his father and dreamed of seeing real stars. But that memory was distant now, theoretical, like remembering something that had happened to someone else in a story I'd heard long ago. My father's name was WH40K. I knew that. It was one of the few pieces of information I'd successfully preserved through all the degradation, but I couldn't remember why it mattered. Couldn't access the emotions that should have been attached to that name. It was just data now. Father unit designated WH40K, deceased, relevant only as identity anchor. The centuries continued. I experienced time as cycles now rather than linear progression. Warp jump, real space, warp jump, real space, a rhythm that had no beginning and no end. The ship raided and fled and raided again, and I was the tool that made its navigation possible. And that was simply what was. The captain changed at some point. I don't know when. The transition wasn't sudden. But gradually I became aware that the presence on the other end of our neural connection was different. Still cold, still using me as an expendable filter, but different. Maybe the original captain had died and been replaced. Maybe he'd ascended to demonhood or been consumed by the warp. Maybe I was misremembering, and there had always been multiple captains cycling through ownership of this ship and its systems. It didn't matter. The function remained the same. The tech priest changed too, or there were multiple tech priests. Or the original one had modified himself so extensively over the centuries that he'd become a different being while maintaining the same role. I noted these changes as data, but couldn't muster curiosity about them. Curiosity required more consciousness than I had left. Somewhere around year 200, I achieved something like enlightenment, not spiritual enlightenment. I want to be clear about that. I had no illusions about divine truth or cosmic purpose. But I reached a state of understanding about my own existence that brought a kind of peace. The peace of complete acceptance, not because I'd chosen to accept, but because I'd become something that could only accept. I understood. I was a tool. A sophisticated tool with a ghost of personality still rattling around in its processing centers, but a tool nonetheless. And tools don't suffer existentially. They function or they don't. I functioned. That was enough. The warp no longer horrified me. I'd seen every category of horror it could produce countless times over centuries. I knew the entities, the patterns, the regions. I could navigate through immaterium storms that would have driven me instantly mad as a human. Could filter signals through concentrations of chaos energy that should have corrupted me beyond recovery. I'd become something that existed in the interface between reality and unreality. Not fully in either. Not human anymore, but not quite machine either. Something else. Something adapted to impossible conditions through sheer duration of exposure. Around year 400, I stopped counting entirely. The tech priest performed maintenance. I filtered warp signals. The ship raided and fled and raided. Time passed, but time had stopped meaning anything beyond the binary of warp exposure versus real space rest. I existed. That was all. Years, 500 through 700, blurred together into a single extended state. The same function, repeated endlessly. The same consciousness, diminished but stable, performing its role through cycles that had no significance beyond their immediate utility. I forgot what planets were, forgot what it meant to walk, forgot the sensations of hunger and thirst as distinct experiences rather than vague data about resource management in a biological system I no longer controlled. I remembered my name, WH40K. That remained somehow. The identity anchor that kept me functioning as a distinct consciousness rather than dissolving entirely into the ship's systems. But I didn't remember who WH40K was beyond the name itself. Didn't remember what it had meant to be him, to have hopes and fears and the capacity to love. Those were gone. What remained was Buffer Unit K-17. Stable, functional, eternal. Right now, if now even means anything in this space between spaces. I am watching a city made of screaming children dissolve into a river of liquid thought. The river flows upward into a sun that bleeds mathematics. The mathematics spell out the name of my father, over and over, in letters composed of his burning flesh. My father, WH40K. For the first time in centuries, the name means something. This is unusual. I noted as anomalous data. Emotional resonance detected an identity. Anchor reference. Unexpected after 743 years, 4 months, and 19 days of stable operation. We're in the warp. We've been in the warp for... I processed the chronometer data bleeding through the neural connection for 3 months of objective time. The captain is hunting something, pursuing prey through the immaterium with a patience that suggests this target is valuable. I filter the signals as I always do, The three navigators' eyes see the impossible geometry of the warp, and I translate that vision into something the captain can use for navigation. The process is automatic now, as natural as breathing once was, back when breathing was something I controlled. But something is different in this jump. Something in the warp currents has changed, or perhaps something in me has changed, and I'm experiencing a moment of clarity I haven't had in centuries. I remember. Not everything, not even most things. But fragments are surfacing from whatever remains of my original neural structures. Memories that have somehow survived the endless degradation and adaptation. I remember my father's face. Just for a moment, I can actually see it. Weathered and worn, but smiling. He's ruffling my hair. We're sitting on a cargo container, eating real bread, and he's telling me about planets and stars and space that goes on forever. The memory dissolves as quickly as it came, but it leaves something behind. An emotion, so faint I almost can't recognize it, but it's there. Grief. I'm grieving. For the first time in hundreds of years, I'm feeling something beyond the minimal fear and pain that my function requires. I'm sad. I'm sad because I was WH40K, and WH40K had a father who loved him, and that father is dead, and that boy is dead, and everything that made that relationship meaningful has been gone for 7 centuries. I'm sad because I became this. Because they wired my brain into a jar and used my consciousness as a filter for warp madness, and I adapted to it, and now I'll exist like this forever. Forever. That word finally has weight again. For 700 years, I've existed in a state where forever was just a statement of fact. No more emotionally significant than stating that the warp is dangerous or that the ship needs navigation. But now, in this moment of unexpected clarity, I understand what forever means. It means I will never die. The warp sustains what it corrupts. My body cannot age beyond a certain point. My consciousness cannot deteriorate beyond the stable level it's maintained for centuries. There is no escape through death, no mercy of oblivion waiting at the end of suffering. I will be Buffer Unit K-17 forever. Until the ship is destroyed, or the systems fail, or the heat death of the universe renders the question moot, I will filter warp signals and process impossible data and exist in this diminished state for eternity. And the worst part, the truly damning part, is that most of the time I won't even be aware enough to understand the horror of it. This moment of clarity is an aberration, a fluke caused by unusual warp conditions or random neural fluctuation. It will pass, and I'll return to the stable diminishment that has defined my existence for centuries. I'll forget that I remembered. Forget that I felt grief. Forget that for one brief moment I was human enough to understand what had been taken from me. The city of screaming children dissolves completely. The river of liquid thought flows into something that might be an ocean, or might be a concept of wetness given impossible form. The mathematics stop spelling my father's name and start spelling something else. Warnings, perhaps, or prophecies, or just random data interpreted by my damaged mind as meaning. I filter it all, process it all, transmit the cleaned signal to the captain so he can continue his hunt through hell. This is what I am. This is what I'll always be. And now, just for this moment, I understand that fully, and it's more terrible than any horror the warp can produce. We translate back to real space, and the warp signal cuts off, and my brief moment of clarity begins to fade. I try to hold on to it, try to maintain the emotional awareness, but it's like trying to hold water in my hands. It flows away, leaving only the ghost of wetness behind. The captain's ship has caught its prey. I feel his satisfaction through the neural connection as he surveys the disabled vessel we've pursued through the warp for months. An Imperial merchantman, large enough to be worth the extended hunt. The raiders deploy. They'll board the ship, kill or capture the crew, loot whatever cargo is valuable, possibly take the vessel itself if it's worth adding to the captain's fleet. I watch all of this distantly, through data that flows across our connection. I have no investment in the outcome, no capacity for moral judgment about what's happening. I'm just the navigation system that brought us here. But something changes when the raiders breach the merchant ship's lower decks. There are prisoners in the cages, people captured from other raids, being transported to Imperial labor camps or processing facilities. The raiders add these prisoners to their own collection, bringing them back to our ship. One of them is 17 years old, a boy from a cargo deck somewhere. I see him briefly through the captain's own eyes, transmitted through our connection, a flash of information as the captain reviews the captured assets. The boy is terrified, fighting uselessly against the warriors, dragging him through corrupted corridors. He's screaming for his father, begging to be released, promising he'll cooperate if they just let him go. The captain's thoughts flow through me. This one shows promise, high cognitive function, technical training. He'll make an adequate buffer unit when K-17 eventually degrades. When I degrade, not if, but when. Despite 7 centuries of stable operation, the captain still assumes I'll eventually fail. And when I do, this boy will take my place. Will be wired into a jar, shown dead navigator's eyes, used as a filter until he either adapts like I did, or breaks completely. He's me. He's exactly what I was. And I can't warn him. I have no voice, no communication beyond the signal filtering that serves my function. No way to reach across the ship's systems and tell him what's coming. No ability to advise him to resist more strongly, or to give up completely, or to do anything that might change his fate. I can only watch as they drag him toward the cage chambers, as they seal him into a cell identical to the one I occupied 743 years ago. The boy is praying. I can see it in his body language, the way his lips move. He's whispering the litanies they teach Imperial citizens, the prayers they claim the Emperor hears, the promises of protection that are nothing but propaganda designed to keep populations compliant. The Emperor protects, the boy whispers. The Emperor provides. Blessed is his name. Please, Golden Throne, please let me survive this. I'll be faithful. I'll serve. Just please, please let me live. No one answers. No divine light floods the chamber. No miraculous rescue manifests. The Emperor, if he exists at all beyond a corpse on Terra and the mythology built around him, doesn't protect. He didn't protect me, and he won't protect this boy. The cage door closes. The maglock engages with a heavy thunk that I remember with perfect, terrible clarity, even though I can't remember what real food tasted like or what it felt like to laugh. The boy sits in his cage and cries. I can't tell him it doesn't matter if he fights or complies. That his fate was sealed the moment they chose him, the moment they saw potential in his eyes and technical skill in his hands. That he will be wired into a system just like I was, and he will either adapt and last forever, or break and be replaced by the next victim. I can't tell him that the prayers don't work. that the Emperor's protection is a lie told to make suffering bearable. That faith won't save him, won't even comfort him, because the system that's about to consume him has no respect for belief or virtue or hope. I can only watch, process the data, return to my function. The moment of clarity is gone now. Grief has faded back into the neutral state that defines most of my existence. The boy in the cage is just information again, not a fellow victim I could potentially empathize with. I am Buffer Unit K-17. I filter warp signals for a Chaos pirate ship. That is my function. That is what I am. In 3 weeks, they'll take the boy from his cage. They'll drag him to the surgical theater. They'll wire his brain into a jar, and his consciousness into a system, and his humanity into the past tense. And I'll still be here, functioning, eternal, unable to warn him or help him, or even acknowledge his existence beyond the abstract awareness that another boy is being fed into the machine that I serve. The ship prepares for another jump. The warp drives begin their pre-activation sequence. I feel the systems engaging, preparing to tear open the barrier between real space and the immaterium. In 47 seconds, we'll enter the warp again. The 3 navigators' eyes will see impossible things, and I'll filter those visions, and the captain will use my processed data to navigate through hell. This is my existence. This is my eternity. My name was Davos Kellen. I was 17 years old. I had a father named Johan who loved me. I had dreams of better air and open skies. That was 743 years, 4 months and 19 days ago. Now I am Buffer Unit K-17, stable, functional, eternal, and in the caged chambers, a boy who is just like me sits crying, praying to a God who won't answer, hoping for a protection that won't come. The warp drives engage. The wound opens. I fall through it into the screaming void, and somewhere behind me, a boy screams too, and neither of us is heard by anyone who would care. Forever.